On April 29, 1945, at 13:47 hours, 8-year-old Hendrika van der Meer heard the familiar deep rumble of bomber engines before she saw them. It was the unmistakable sound that had meant devastation for 5 long years. She looked up from the tulip bulb she was trying to chew, her stomach empty after 3 days without proper food, and saw the formations coming in low over the Hague. Her mother pulled her close, both pressed against the damaged wall of their apartment building. The British Lancasters were flying at an impossibly low altitude, perhaps 400 feet, close enough to make out individual aircraft and hear the roar of the engines that shook windows and made the ground tremble. "They're coming to finish us," someone shouted from across the street. After the failure of Market Garden and the brutal German reprisals that followed, the Dutch had learned to fear the bombers. But these weren't climbing to bombing altitude. They were holding that dangerously low course, and their bomb bay doors were opening. Then the first parachutes deployed. Not bombs, but canvas sacks tumbling from the aircraft's bellies. The parachutes snapped open as packages floated down toward the streets and parks of The Hague. One landed just 30 meters from Hendrika, bursting open on impact. Loaves of bread rolled across the cobblestones, tins of meat scattered, and a chocolate bar slid to a stop near her feet. Her mother stared, confused for a moment, before understanding broke through. She ran towards the scattered food, crying and laughing, unable to comprehend the reality of what was happening around them. Other Dutch civilians were emerging from shelters and damaged buildings, rushing toward the falling packages. Gathering food that seemed impossible to be real, Hendrika picked up the chocolate bar with trembling hands, recognizing the British wrapper with its royal crest and English text. She hadn't seen chocolate since 1942. She looked up at the Lancaster still overhead, its crew visible through the windows, and waved with desperate gratitude. Inside the bomber, Flight Lieutenant James Wilson saw the waving Dutch civilians and felt a tightness in his throat. 4 years of war had taught him to compartmentalize and complete missions without thinking about the targets below. But this mission was different. These weren't enemy positions or industrial targets. They were starving civilians, once allies who had suffered under occupation. His bomber's payload was food instead of explosives, a first in hundreds of missions, where he had dropped something meant to save rather than destroy. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944–45 was a result of deliberate starvation imposed by German occupation forces as punishment for Dutch resistance and Allied military operations. The crisis began after the failure of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, which had aimed to capture bridges across the Rhine and liberate the Netherlands. The operation had failed catastrophically, leaving the northern Netherlands under German control while the southern provinces were liberated. In response to the Dutch support for the Allies, the Germans imposed severe restrictions on food distribution. Rail transport was shut down, canals were blocked, and food supplies from agricultural areas could no longer reach cities. This policy was explicitly punitive, aiming to starve the population into submission. The winter of 1944–45 was exceptionally harsh. Rivers froze and roads became impassable. The little food that remained in the cities couldn't be replenished by imports, and the fuel ran out, forcing families to burn furniture and books for warmth. Electricity was cut off and water systems failed. The urban infrastructure collapsed entirely. The Dutch population turned to desperate measures for survival. They boiled leather for soup and ate tulip bulbs, the country's famous flour reduced to starvation food. They traded valuables in the countryside for any remaining food, but German restrictions made this increasingly difficult. By April 1945, the situation was dire. In Amsterdam alone, deaths from starvation exceeded 200 per day. Hospitals were unable to treat the sick, as medications were no longer available. Doctors helplessly watched people die from diseases that would have been easily treatable under normal conditions. Morgues overflowed, and bodies were buried in mass graves, as individual funerals were impossible. The solution, however, required a desperate negotiation with the enemy. The British proposed Operation Manna, food drops by RAF bombers flying at extremely low altitudes to ensure accuracy and demonstrate peaceful intent. The risks were enormous. German anti-aircraft guns were still operational, and fighter aircraft were available to intercept. A single German flak commander deciding to open fire could turn a mercy mission into a massacre. The operation required German approval to proceed to ensure that fire was held during the food drops. Complex negotiations took place through neutral intermediaries, Swedish Red Cross representatives, Swiss diplomats, and underground resistance networks. The Germans were informed that RAF bombers would follow specified routes at designated times, dropping only food. Any attack on these missions would be considered a war crime and prosecuted after the inevitable German surrender. German military authorities agreed, partly due to the recognition that the war was lost, partly because they understood that allowing civilian starvation would worsen their treatment after surrender, and partly out of simple humanity, which still existed even among the forces responsible for occupation. However, the agreement was fragile depending on whether communication reached all German units and if individual commanders chose not to fire. Despite bombers flying at low altitudes where they could not miss, RAF Bomber Command issued mission briefings that highlighted both the humanitarian importance and extreme risk of the operation. The bombers would fly at an altitude of 400 feet, where German ground fire would be devastating. They would follow precise routes over still occupied territory, relying entirely on German agreement to hold fire. However, there was no guarantee that this agreement would reach all units or that individual commanders might ignore it. A single nervous gunner opening fire could collapse the operation. The briefing concluded with a call for volunteers. Squadron commanders expected perhaps half of the crew members to volunteer for such a dangerous mission, but nearly every crew volunteered. After 4 years of dropping bombs, the opportunity to drop food instead was irresistible. These were men who had flown dozens or even hundreds of combat missions, seen their friends die, and delivered destruction to German industrial targets. The chance to save rather than destroy represented something profound, a demonstration that the purpose of fighting went beyond violence, that victory included mercy, and that they were more than instruments of destruction. Preparing for Operation Manna required transforming bomber squadrons from tools of destruction into humanitarian relief forces. The Lancasters and other bombers had their bomb racks modified to carry food packages instead of explosives. Each aircraft would carry between 3 and 5 tons of supplies: flour, bread, canned meat, dried, milk, chocolate, cigarettes, and medical supplies. The packages were carefully secured to prevent damage during the drop, and marked with British and Dutch flags to identify them as humanitarian aid. The food itself had to be durable enough to survive the drop from 400 feet, nutritious enough to address severe malnutrition, and packaged in quantities that Dutch civilians could easily transport and distribute. Bread was baked specifically for the operation, made harder than normal to prevent crushing. Flour was double-bagged to prevent bursting, and tins were selected for their strength. Everything was designed to reach the ground intact and be immediately useful. The drop zones were planned with precision, which was unusual for bomber operations. Instead of flying high above to minimize exposure to ground fire, the aircraft would fly at 400 feet, following exact paths that kept them over designated drop zones, parks, fields, and open areas where the food could be recovered without endangering civilians. The navigation required perfect timing and coordination, with dozens of bombers following precise routes at dangerously low altitudes with no margin for error. The crews received briefings that emphasized both the mission's importance and personal risk. They would be flying low enough that even a single machine gun could bring down an aircraft. They would depend entirely on the German forces to hold fire as agreed. If fighting resumed, they would be defenseless, Flight Lieutenant Wilson, who had flown 47 bombing missions over Germany, later described the briefing as the most anxious he had ever experienced. Bombing targets at 20,000 feet felt relatively safe, as height and speed offered protection. But this mission, flying at 400 feet and straight over enemy positions, offered no protection. If they were fired upon, they would be dead. But the alternative, watching Dutch civilians starve, was unacceptable. So they volunteered. The first drop of Operation Manna took place on April 29, 1945. The first wave of bombers launched from RAF Milton Hall and other bases in eastern England. The formations crossed the North Sea at normal altitude, then descended to 400 feet as they approached the Dutch coast. The aircraft were low enough that Dutch civilians could see the crew's faces through the windows. The bombing runs, if they could be called that, were executed with the precision that reflected years of combat experience, now applied to a humanitarian purpose. The bomb aimers, who had previously calculated trajectories for high explosives, now calculated the drop points for food packages. The pilots, who had fought through flak and fighters, maintained steady courses over Dutch cities, watching for any sign that German forces might open fire. The gunners, who had defended the bombers from enemy aircraft, now nervously watched ground positions, knowing they were helpless if the shooting started. The first packages fell over The Hague at 13:45 hours. Instead of the dramatic explosions crews were used to seeing, the parachutes deployed, releasing canvas and nylon packages drifting gently towards the streets and parks, where Dutch civilians had gathered after spotting the approaching bombers. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Dutch families, who had been starving for months, saw food falling from the sky like a biblical miracle. They ran towards the drop zones, gathering the packages, weeping with relief and disbelief. Some fell to their knees, others waved Dutch flags they had hidden throughout the occupation. Children spelled "thank you" in giant letters on the ground, with sheets so the bomber crews could see them. Inside the bombers, hardened combat veterans found themselves crying behind their oxygen masks. They had spent years delivering destruction to Germany, watching cities burn, knowing they were killing civilians as well as destroying military targets. Now they were delivering life to people who had once been their allies. Watching Dutch civilians celebrate rather than fleeing or dying had a profound and unexpected emotional impact. Some of the crews spontaneously added their own rations to the drop: chocolate bars, cigarettes, biscuits, and personal supplies thrown from the windows with messages written on the wrappers. "With love from England, hold on, help is coming. God bless you." These messages were unnecessary but carried great significance. They represented a personal connection between the crews and the civilians below. It was a recognition that this was a humanitarian mission, one that transcended military objectives. German forces watched without interfering. Anti-aircraft crews stood beside their guns, but refrained from firing. Some German soldiers even helped Dutch civilians carry the packages, silently acknowledging that the war was effectively over and that continuing to inflict suffering served no purpose. A few German officers later admitted that the food drops were their first understanding of what defeat would mean, that allies capable of this mercy might extend it to Germany itself. The Chisto operation grew over the following 10 days. What began as a modest effort expanded into one of the largest humanitarian airlifts ever conducted during active combat. The RAF flew over 3,000 sorties, dropping 6,000 tons of supplies to Dutch cities. The United States Army Air Force joined with a parallel effort, Operation Chowhound, adding American bombers to the humanitarian mission. Between the British and American efforts, over 11,000 tons of food reached starving Dutch civilians, while German forces still controlled the territory. The drops occurred daily, weather permitting. Bomber streams that had once carried explosives now carried bread and flour. Aircraft that had targeted German industrial sites now supplied Dutch cities. The operational tempo mirrored combat operations with multiple sorties daily. Precise navigation and detailed planning, all focused on feeding rather than fighting, The Dutch population quickly organized to collect and distribute the supplies. Resistance networks coordinated distribution to prevent hoarding and ensure the food reached those most in need. Local authorities worked with British liaison officers who were parachuted in to help coordinate supply needs and drop locations. The entire operation evolved into a collaboration between Allied forces, Dutch resistance, and the civilian population. The diversity of food increased as the operation continued. Initial drops focused on staples like flour, bread, and canned meat. Later drops included dried milk for children, medical supplies for hospitals, chocolate and cigarettes for morale, and even seeds for planting gardens that would provide food after the occupation ended. The supplies represented a comprehensive approach to addressing the starvation crisis: immediate calories to prevent deaths, medical supplies to treat malnutrition-related diseases, and resources for longer-term food security. The psychological impact was as significant as the nutritional benefit. Dutch civilians, who had endured 5 years of occupation, watched their country destroyed, and saw thousands die from starvation, now received tangible evidence that the Allies had not forgotten them. The food represented more than just calories. It was proof that liberation was coming, that their suffering was ending, and that they had survived long enough to witness freedom. The success of Operation Manna masked the substantial risks that could have turned the humanitarian mission into a tragedy. The aircraft flew over territory where German forces still had the capability to inflict catastrophic casualties. Anti-aircraft batteries remained operational with ammunition and trained crews, and fighter aircraft were still available, though increasingly grounded by fuel shortages. The agreement to hold fire was fragile, dependent on communication reaching all units, individual commanders choosing to comply, and no misunderstandings or accidents triggering combat. Several incidents nearly brought the operation to an end. A German anti-aircraft crew at Rotterdam began tracking RAF bombers before their commander ordered them to stand down. An American bomber strayed from its designated route and nearly triggered defensive fire before Dutch resistance members signaled German forces that it was part of the humanitarian operation. A British aircraft suffered a mechanical failure and crashed, though fortunately no casualties were reported. In liberated territory, rather than over the occupied zone, where crews risked capture, the weather presented constant challenges. The low-altitude flights in April meant navigating through rain, fog, and wind, which made precision drops difficult and increased the risk of aircraft collisions. Several bombers returned with weather damage, one even suffering a lightning strike that knocked out its electrical systems. Yet it managed to complete the drop before withdrawing. The crews understood the risks but flew anyway. Squadron loss rates during Operation Manna were 0. No aircraft was lost to enemy action, and no crews were killed. But that outcome wasn't guaranteed. Every sortie represented a conscious decision by crews to risk their lives, delivering food to people they'd never met in a country they had been fighting over. Depending on enemy forces showing restraint, which couldn't be certain, Flight Lieutenant Wilson later reflected on the risk calculation. We'd risked our lives hundreds of times dropping bombs. Risking them to drop food seemed the least we could do. If we'd been shot down during Manna, at least we'd have died doing something worthwhile rather than just destroying more cities. That mattered to us, the timing of Operation Manna. In the final days of April 1945, directly preceded the German surrender and the Dutch liberation. On May 5th, German forces in the Netherlands surrendered unconditionally, and Allied forces entered Dutch cities within hours, completing the liberation that Market Garden had failed to achieve 8 months earlier. The food drops had kept the population alive through those final critical weeks. Had Operation Manna not occurred, thousands more would have died in those final days before liberation. The Dutch population greeted Allied forces with celebrations that reflected months of accumulated gratitude. British and Canadian troops entering Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague were mobbed by crowds waving flags, throwing flowers, embracing soldiers, and singing anthems. The celebrations were joyous, but carried a desperate edge. These were people who had survived starvation through a combination of endurance and Allied intervention. Many Dutch civilians specifically sought out RAF crews to thank them for the food drops. Families brought photographs showing parachutes falling, packages being collected, and food being distributed. They described what the drops had meant, the difference between survival and death, between hope and despair, between holding on through the final days and giving up. The final mission for the Netherlands occurred on May 4, 1945. Flight Lieutenant Wilson flew his last humanitarian sortie. Just hours before the German surrender, his Lancaster carried flour and medical supplies to Rotterdam, dropping them with precision that reflected hundreds of combat missions repurposed for preservation rather than destruction. He watched Dutch civilians gathering the packages below, waving flags and spelling messages of gratitude with sheets. He had seen many things during his 4 years of war: cities burning, aircraft exploding, friends dying. He had delivered thousands of tons of explosives to German targets, knowing that his actions killed people, even while serving a legitimate military purpose. But flying at 400 feet over a Dutch city, dropping food to starving civilians, and seeing gratitude rather than destruction, that felt like what they had been fighting for all along. Not just defeating Germany, but proving that civilization meant something. That Allied victory would include mercy. That power could be used to preserve rather than destroy. His bomber reported that the packages were deployed successfully, and Wilson banked the Lancaster toward England, climbing to a safer altitude, leaving behind Dutch civilians who would survive because British bombers had delivered bread instead of bombs. The war would officially end within days. Germany would surrender unconditionally, and Allied forces would occupy German territory, beginning the difficult work of reconstruction and reconciliation. But Operation Manna had already demonstrated what victory would mean, not just the military defeat of the enemy, but a positive affirmation of the values that made victory worthwhile. British pilots had risked their lives, dropping food to people who had been friends before war separated them. They flew dangerously low over enemy-controlled territory, depending on restraint from forces who could have easily killed them. They did this because watching civilians starve was intolerable, because they were fighting for principles that included mercy, because power meant nothing if not used to preserve life when possible. The grey dawn over the Netherlands revealed cities where Dutch families were eating British bread, where children were drinking British milk, and where hospitals were treating patients with British medical supplies. The bombers that had symbolized destruction had become instruments of preservation. The crews that had delivered death to Germany had delivered life to the Netherlands. Wilson crossed the English coast as the sun rose, his aircraft empty except for the crew. All supplies had been dropped and the mission was complete. But the experience would remain with him for a lifetime. Operation Manna had proven that, even in the final days of total war, humanity survived. That mercy was possible. That British forces fought not just against evil, but for something better. That victory included compassion. The starving Dutch families who wept when British pilots risked their lives to drop food would remember that compassion forever. The bread that fell from the sky became a legend, a story passed down through generations, proof that even in war's darkest moments, there could be light. The British pilots who flew those missions remembered them as the most meaningful of their service. The times they saved rather than destroyed, preserved rather than fought, and demonstrated through their actions what Allied victory actually meant. The grey morning when bombers crossed back to England, empty of food but carrying the satisfaction of a mission completed, marked something essential about British character and Allied values. Power used for preservation, risk accepted for humanitarian purpose, and victory defined not just by defeating enemies, but by saving innocents. These principles, demonstrated through bread falling from the sky over starving Netherlands, proved what the war had been about more clearly than any battlefield triumph ever could.